Oh my goodness. So here we are again.
Here we are.
Yeah,
Can you hear me, Tsitsi?
I
Can you
can
hear me?
hear you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you perfectly. Can everyone else hear us? Yay. Ndegwa says it's all good. So, yeah, finally. Sorry about that. It's been a crazy afternoon. We should just have a white wedding to cleanse us of all these
Exactly.
misfortunes.
To solve all the problems, right? With a white wedding.
So, perhaps we can continue from there. And you were explaining to us what the wedding meant for your character and to you as a writer when you wrote it. And maybe we can take it from there.
Yes. Yes. So the white wedding, it was really poking fun at Christianity, in that the way Christianity was brought to this part of the world was that if you become a Christian and you pray to God, everything will automatically work. And in fact, we still see a lot of that kind of thinking in the way many Christians behave on the continent now. And so already there, I had realized that it wasn't quite like that. Again, it was to show how even the character of Babamkuru did not have anything under control and did not have the answers. You know, that's why the title of the book is Nervous Conditions. It's not one person's nervous condition, but it is many people's nervous conditions. So for me, when I think about the book, I would be able to map a kind of a neurotic situation for all of the characters, for each of the characters. And so this was Babankuru. He was meant to have everything under control, but of course he didn't. And then he starts grasping back to things like Christianity, which had no meaning for the people for whom he was propounding this situation.
True. And ironically, I mean, they were already, looking to go to mediums and traditional medicine or solutions anyway, and he just came back with another one, just that it's a different
time. That's a really interesting point that you bring up, because there's been a lot of talk recently about African traditional religion and people pushing back against the idea that it's demonic and this kind of thing. And so again, there was that juxtaposition of white religion, Christian religion, as it had been brought, being labeled as good, as that which will fulfill you and get you what you want, whereas Babamkuru has taken in this idea of African traditional religion being demonic and being satanic, etc. I think that the way we engage with this is maybe a bit too polarized. I think every religion has got its good and its bad side. And so when we look at ATR, we should also be looking at what are the positives and what are the negatives, rather than just seeing it as a utopian substitute for Christianity, which has been quite negative towards Black people in some ways.
Sure. I have a question from Troy here, which says, you are a prolific writer and filmmaker. Which medium do you feel you've reached a greater audience through?
That's really interesting. I can't gauge how many people read books, because people buy them and they read them, and unless I meet them or meet them online, I have no way of knowing. Okay, book sales are one thing, but books change hands, people download offline, so I really don't know. With the films, I feel that I get a much more immediate response to them, because people see the film and they react to it there and then. So that's something I like about film, is the immediacy of the reaction. And I also feel that I have, until recently, been aiming at different audiences. I haven't really made a long feature film of my own. The one that people know a lot about is Neria, but Neria was actually commissioned by other people. So again, we have the issue for African women filmmakers that used to obtain with writing, that we're at a point now where we want to tell our stories in film, but it's not really easy to be able to tell those stories, and we're talking more about what other people want us to say. Also, when you think about where the funding comes from, someone else has got to approve your funding before you can even make your film. Whereas with writing, you can just write. So for me, maybe it's a question of where do I feel I have been able to project my voice better, in writing or in film. And from that point of view, I would definitely say that I have been able to project my voice better in writing, because there are fewer filters and more opportunities.
Absolutely. That's very powerful. And do you feel like, you know, because you tell stories through the different mediums, do you feel that each medium affects how you approach your storytelling? I mean, does one, you know, affect the other and vice versa?
That's a really interesting question. You know, when I was starting out as a filmmaker, I really found I had to keep the two disciplines separate because the craft is very different. The formal tools that you use are quite different. The creative tools are similar, but the formal tools that you use to actualize that creative proposition are quite different. And so I really did keep them separate. But now that I'm more comfortable as a script writer and as a filmmaker, I do feel that there's a lot of overlap. I think it might be easier to go from film writing to writing prose, because the thing is, with writing prose, you are so much into detail and so much into character and so much into the interiority of your protagonist worlds. And that doesn't work that well for film. And so it was really good to keep them separate, but now I do see that they feed off each other. And that's a nice development I have found.
Wow, nice. I've got a question here from Nigerian who's asking, the monoble body, we see Tambu and who she becomes. I feel really showing us the nervous condition post-colonialism. Did you see this insights when writing Nervous Conditions?
Do you know, I didn't. I did not see that at all. I was writing in the early 1980s, and that was just after independence in Zimbabwe. So really my vision was that, okay, we're going forward from here and we're not looking back. And I wanted to inform as many young female people of that, so that they didn't get bogged down in tradition and culture and not be able to take that path for themselves. So I certainly didn't see it happening. Now, in this mournable body, we do have the post-colonial nervous condition. And that is caused, of course, by the coloniality that continues, but also because of the structures that have been created post-independence. And so it was important for me to examine that, and to examine it in a way that would enable people to go along with the story. You know, because we have so many, in fact, it's so easy for us just to criticize our governments and point fingers and say they are the bad government. But I always say to people, you know, I'll take Zimbabwe as an example. If Zimbabweans were of a different caliber, we would have naturally a different caliber of government. But it's the Zimbabweans themselves who are going into these positions. So it means it is something that we have to look at holistically with respect to the whole society. And so this is really what I was attempting to do with this mournable body and Tambudzai's trajectory there. To remember that, yes, there have been causes, as in colonialism, and for some of us, liberation struggles, which were armed conflicts and were very vicious and traumatizing. But at the same time, we do have to take responsibility, and we do have to develop ourselves into the kind of individuals who can create a healthy society.
Absolutely, absolutely. I have a question from Zukiswa here, who's saying in both the Book of Not and this mournable body, you resuscitate Tracy, who we saw in Nervous Conditions. Tracy in all three books is the quintessential white girl in her engagement with Tamu. Would you like to speak about that?
Yes, yes. For me, I found that I could not engage sufficiently in the way I wanted to with the context of Zimbabwean society without examining race. And of course, to do that, I had to have a figure who could carry all the issues that I felt needed to be carried. And I didn't want to go into caricatures, and I'd already created this world. So I needed to have a character who could also parallel Tambudzai going through. We've just had this issue of the Amy Cooper issue, who wanted to call the police, in fact, called the police in the USA on a black man and lied that he was threatening her life simply because he had asked her to obey the law. And so the issues are very real. I think what was also important for me is this idea of global feminism, and where it breaks down on certain demographics like race. It was important for me to throw that into relief. At the same time, I was conscious of the fact that one has to do it in a relatively gentle way, let's say. Otherwise, there would be a lot of pushback against that. And not only from white women, the number of black people who tell me that I'm nasty to white people and want to censure me for that in Zimbabwe today is really quite phenomenal. So yeah, definitely Tracy had that function in all the three books. And again, I try to bring some complexity into her character along the lines of, as a white person, a white woman, she would also be suffering more in earlier farm, and how it had been bequeathed to her brother, etc. It went into a little bit more depth, but that didn't help Tambudzai's story, so it ended up being edited out. But I wanted to show that even when you understand the complexity of white women and the issues that they have to resolve for themselves, the issue of white women's class position, power position with respect to black women is real. And for me, it really, in this mournable body, it was really focused on that moment where Tracy has to tell Tambudzai that her mother and all the women in the village have to dance bare-breasted. And so Tracy actually does give this message to Tambudzai, who has to then go back to her village and her mother and say, look, the tourist company says that when the tourists come, you will have to be bare-breasted because that's what the tourists want. And for me, that was the moment of really defining, it's a bit like the raw and the cooked, the naked and the clothed. So in that context, Tracy belongs to the clothed, and Tambudzai belongs to the naked. I've lost you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? What's gone wrong? I didn't actually touch anything. So very strange. When did you lose me? No, it should be working. You can't hear me. Oh, but they're saying, yes, we can hear. Oh, thank you. So it's only Natasha who can't hear me. Oh, we can't hear you, Natasha. Great. I hope we get okay. So I was just basically talking about Tracy and the treatment of whiteness in this mournable body, but actually that goes through that thread goes through all the three novels. And I think Tambudzai's struggle through all the three novels is to overcome this ranking of whiteness and blackness. It's not so apparent in nervous conditions because the people she aspires to be like are her relatives. But her relatives also stand in for whiteness in the sense that they have been anglicized, and they stand in for whiteness in the sense that Tambudzai juxtaposes them to the village and in that way chooses what they represent over what their own home her own home represents. So then we see in the Book of Not where she actually physically goes to knit scarves and things for the Rhodesian soldiers, whereas some of the other black girls in her school did not go. So she again chooses for whiteness. And she chooses for whiteness on the basis that it's a humanitarian action. You know, we are all human beings together. And the question doesn't arise for her that if I am making this choice, authority cannot be questioned. And we see this then transferring even into our political systems, where very often the strong men do not want to be questioned by anybody. And so then going through to this mournable body, there's a point where Tambudzai is in a sanatorium, and there's a white woman in the sanatorium as well. It's a mental health sanatorium. And this white woman calls Tambudzai her daughter, you know, and that is kind of like a seminal moment for Tambudzai because she has been so accustomed to judging people according to whether they are white or black that this woman who is senile, you know, she's an older woman, that's why she's in the sanatorium, no longer sees color. And in a way, it validates Tambudzai because she feels that, oh, now I'm this white woman's daughter. But it does allow her to think beyond color for maybe the first time in her life. So, you know, it's very difficult. I find it very difficult to negotiate issues of color in my writing, maybe because I feel so strongly about them, and also because there are such sensitive issues in this part of the world. But I hope that I did manage to bring up some of the questions that need to be asked and to provide some analysis on that. I think I did not do too badly because at the end of this mournable body, Tambudzai has been living in Tracy's company house. And so she, after this debacle with her mother and the village women having to dance at least bare-breasted, she decides she can't go on with this. So this was like the moment that she realizes that she cannot follow whiteness to that extent, and she leaves the company. And I have Tracy offering her good terms for a mortgage on the house, you know, and this was okay, it was to make life work basically, and maybe to hint, you know, we can be a bit softer and a bit gentler on each other. But I hope that the critique of whiteness or if anybody just wants to ask me to comment on any part of any of the trilogy, I will read it and endeavor to do that. So while maybe people are thinking about it, I didn't always think it was going to be a trilogy. I had, you know, as Natasha said in the beginning, she asked, and she was asking about whether I had seen that trajectory happening. And I said, no, for me, it was this moment in time. You know, we're celebrating, but I can foresee that there's going to be some trouble, and I need to prepare people for it. But I hadn't seen that it would take 2 more books to do it. So there was that question about UNU, and it's gone now. Oh, let's see. Can you talk on how your notion of UNU has developed through your writings? That's a profound question, in fact, because, you know, in Southern Africa, at least, we are very much involved with this philosophy of life, which is Ubuntu UNU. We call it UNU here, and further south, people call it Ubuntu. And we say it is an African philosophy by which we live. And to be honest, I don't see that that's true. I think that we have an idea that we once had a philosophy called UNU, but I'm not sure that it was really the fully developed philosophy that we claim it was, because even looking back into pre-colonial times, I mean, there were some really awful kinds of violations of human dignity that took place then. Okay, the cultural context was different, so that maybe it wasn't perceived as being a violation of human dignity, but nevertheless, there were some terrible things that happened. I mean, even beyond slavery and the different forms of it, the East Coast slavery, the West Coast slavery, and how those institutions were prosecuted. There were some terrible things that happened. And so I'm really not sure that this idea of UNU was really something that life was anchored in. I think it was probably more of a mythology of how we might be. Now, I think that's not a bad thing. I think if we can understand it as that, we can use it as something that is fluid, so that we can more easily pull it forward and don't link it back to old practices. We can then, for me, start asking the question, what would a 2020s Ubuntu look like? What would a 2020s UNU look like? In what sectors of life would we be able to apply this beneficially, and in what sectors can we not? So I would say that writing and engaging with the question of UNU there was, it helped me to develop my thinking about it. And in fact, this mournable body can be seen as answering this question that I have asked: what is a practical UNU for the 21st century? Because when we see Tambudzai, she is certainly not in any form of UNU at all. And then by the end of it, when she has done this terrible thing and made her family dance bare-breasted, the females in her family and the village dance bare-breasted for European tourists, she realizes that we cannot go on like this. You know, and in this case, Tambudzai is a character, yes, but she stands in for example, our leaders, the kind of rapacious behavior they have towards us. You know, at some point we have to have an UNU that will also enable them to stop themselves behaving in that kind of way. You know, I don't know whether we're really going there. I have asked about Zimbabwean philosophers, for example, and I think I was told that there was one mathematician philosopher. And when you look around on the continent, we don't really have people who are engaging with those kinds of issues at a philosophical level as much as would need to happen with the 1 billion people population that we have. These are careers that are not really valued in our part of the world, where we need to be really concerned about putting food on the table. But I think that unless we do have people, intellectuals, whose function is to engage with such problems, we're not going to find the solutions. Because obviously, if you're an accountant or you're a business person, you don't have time to dig deeply into those questions. And yet the questions are there and they are not answered. And in many ways, we are still like Babamkuru, we are still floundering. We don't know what to do. And so we're grasping at straws. So we actually need to have people whose function it is to provide those kinds of answers. And every society has had those people. We can say that we are possibly one of the few societies that didn't. The traditional societies had the spirit mediums and the wise people and those who carried the spirit of the clan, called them Hondoro and Shona. You know, we had that. And so it's only in this period now that we have lost that institution of wisdom. That's what I would call it. You know, our leaders have advisors, but I would not call them people who represent an institution of wisdom often on this continent. And I think we need to be thinking about growing that sector of wisdom and attaching value to it. So, do we have any more questions here? Did I find that my writing style changed over the 3 books? That's a really interesting question, and it's one that I'm really happy to answer because it was such a traumatizing experience. I don't know whether I would say that my writing style changed over the 3 books. What I would say is that in order to tell the different stories that I told in the 3 books, I felt compelled to engage with them differently. You know, nervous conditions, once I understood what I was doing, it was quite easy to find the style. You know, it's this woman looking back at her ambitious, youthful, young self, really, and, you know, quite a cheeky self who really enjoyed her intellectual abilities. So that lent to certain ways of presenting things. But now, come to the Book of Not, one is in a different situation. We don't have this and I did try to write it in the first person and it just wasn't working. You know, the story was just so horrible. I didn't enjoy writing it in the first person. And I didn't think that people would enjoy reading or that kind of thing in the first person. And so I felt that maybe I should try the third person, but then I realized that that would be too big a jump since the other 2 books had been in the first person. And so that's when I decided to engage with the second person. And so for me, generally, the content will dictate how I go stylistically. I'm sure that the people who are academics, excuse me, I'm sure that the academics will tell me about what's consistent over the 3 books and what isn't consistent, and maybe also in She No Longer Weeps, which is the play I wrote. But for me, I would say that really my intention and the subject matter come together for me to tell me that it is best written in this way. So, I'm just looking to see if there were any more questions that I missed. You have this is Ndegwanguru. Thanks to the trilogy, you have managed to recount female experiences through the literal medium. What do you see as the role of African female writers today? You know, I don't feel that writers have a role in society. I think the function of writers is to tell stories. And stories are crucial for society and have been since time immemorial, you know, because even those ancient paintings on caves, they tell a story. They tell a story of a man who had an encounter with an ox-like beast or something, or a man who was at a dance. You know, we don't see that many female figures, as far as I know, in those rock paintings. So it's a form of communication. And I would not like to prescribe to African women writers what they have to communicate. I think every writer knows what they want to communicate and what is important for them. And that is how it should be, because we need the diversity of thought and the diversity of experience to act as mirrors for ourselves. You know, if we just have one kind of prescription, we are not going to get that range of experience. We're not going to be able to use it to see our own selves in different lights as well. And so I'm just really so happy when writers come up with things that I would never have thought about. And so if there are things that I would never have thought about, I'm not in a position to be saying that that's what they should be writing about. So I think the issue is to be brave and to trust your voice. You know that voice, you know what it's telling you to write. And other people are probably saying, oh, that kind of thing doesn't sell. Or a friend is saying, excuse me, a friend is saying, I've read so-and-so's book and I really love it. You know, I wish we had more books like that. And that can amount to pressure. But I feel that one has to ignore that and really just listen to one's own voice. And the world will be very grateful to you when you do that. So let's see, is there anything else? Can you hear us? Natasha, can you hear? Oh, that's good. Okay. So here, Njerian says, oh, it's really a comment about everyone's child. I think that was a comment on the UNU. Yes, Natasha can type a question. Would I consider a film adaptation for the trilogy? That's a loaded question. You probably didn't realize, or maybe you did, but you know, the obstacles to Black people representing themselves in film are huge. And I did mention it a little bit earlier. And for people who follow African American film, there was a time when people like Spike Lee and Wesley Snipes were always talking about how difficult it was to make films. And it took African Americans to consciously come together and put their resources together to say, these are the films we want, these are the stories we want to tell about ourselves in film. And that's when it began to happen. I mean, now you can go onto Netflix and many platforms and see lots of content about Black people, which is, you know, recognizable, hasn't been distorted beyond recognition. Whereas when your cinematic narrative is being filtered through the eyes of white producers and white script developers, you will end up with such a huge distortion. You know, it's kind of like the distorted way that we look at ourselves because of having been subjected to white supremacist rankings in terms of how you look physically, your language, etc. You know, this battle that we go through with in that situation. And so it's very similar with film. It's difficult for a filmmaker, a Black filmmaker, to tell her or his own story if it is being filtered through the prerequisites for funding, for getting white capital. And so for me, nervous conditions, the last time somebody who lives in Los Angeles was interested, said, look, I'll pitch it to a few people. And the message that came back to me was that it was too African, so they won't be interested. That's what they think. There's a huge African American population there. So that means that probably the only way that that story could be told is for African people to finance it. And really, we are not there yet. We don't even have a continental industry. Of course, Nigeria has an industry which is working, you know, and employing and producing, and that's fabulous. East Africa, especially Tanzania, is coming up, but we really don't have an African industry. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the money is coming from outside still. You know, you send your scripts to Holland, you send your scripts to Germany, the Berlinale, to Cannes. And again, it's white people sitting down to say, what is a good African story? And most of these stories that are said to be good African stories by white people don't resonate with us. So unless we can really start getting at least regional systems together where we can have substantial pots of money, I think that it will take a long time for our good stories to be adapted to film. And I think that it's a shame for both the writers and for cinema, because our good stories already have content. We just have to adapt it to the screen. When people see it on the screen, it's probably a different than the people who have read. So we would expanding the for books, but we haven't got there. It's something that I'm working on, and I will continue to work on, and I'm sure a lot of you are also working on it. But it's the next frontier. You know, we've conquered the page. We now need to conquer the screen. Yeah, so Kiswa, this question of a sad question about the parallels with Tambuzai as an authority figure and her violence towards a child versus state-sanctioned violence in many African countries. Yes, you know, as I was saying, that Tambuzai is a character and she goes through her trajectory of development as an individual, but at the same time, she represents many people in our societies. So can you imagine if Tambuzai had become a minister of defense or something? You know, what kind of society she would have contributed to in that capacity. So all these people with nervous conditions who do not have a properly defined concept of UNU, who are behaving in these ways that lack UNU, that lack humanity. And that was one of the messages that I really did want to drive home with this mournable body. I don't think that we read enough. Definitely in Zimbabwe, most of the people in leadership positions do not read, or if they do, they don't read local literature. You know, they'll read Sun Tzu, The Art of War, and, you know, how to battle, how to win battles, and, you know, how to do intelligence and that kind of thing. But a lot of people in those positions don't really understand the value of reading literature in terms of forming UNU. And, you know, when I look at Zimbabwe, I really cannot see that this was a society that had a real concept of UNU, because how does it disappear so quickly? And how does materialism become such a driving motivational force? I did some research, a little bit of research on East African coast slavery for a project I was doing I did in Zambia and Tanzania. And, you know, it's quite horrifying. Things haven't really changed. I read one book about the Yao people in northern Mozambique's eastern Malawi and southern Tanzania. And, you know, how they became slave traders themselves. They liked the bagging of the guns. And, you know, they would go down to the coast. Maybe it started off with selling, I don't know, bark cloth or whatever they took down there. And they would see the guns and they would like it and would want the gunpowder and a gun to fire at a wedding or at childbirth or something. And so when they were told, okay, you know, bring me half a dozen slaves, and you'll get a gun and some gunpowder the next time you come down. They did it. And, we haven't really progressed very far beyond that, in my opinion. And this was what I was trying to put through with Tambuzai, who was willing to even have her family, the females in her family, dance bare-breasted. We'll do anything for money, or many of us will do anything for money, and it always ends in tears. So I think it's important for us to get people who have that kind of consciousness into leadership positions. It's very difficult because, especially in the Southern African part of the world, the impact of these liberation struggles, with 5 big liberation struggles. It was Angola, Namibia, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and South Africa. With those 5 big liberation struggles, the militarization of thought and to engage with at every level that we can. It's often very difficult to do so because these liberation struggles were fought quite a long time ago. And so they're not within the easy frame of reference of younger writers. But it is something we have to engage with, because this militarization is something that is going to haunt us for a long time unless we start dismantling it. So, might there be African philosophers? Have we lost them? People just don't study philosophy. Can you imagine? I mean, in let's say 1980, 1990, even 2000, somebody telling a family that's thinking, okay, this person is going to get a profession and have a career and contribute to the family's livelihood. That's the extended family, saying, oh, I'm going to be a philosopher. Okay, and as a philosopher, what do you do? Oh, I think. I don't think that kind of thing would go down well. And even today, I don't think it would go down well. I'm sure that many people who are writers or beginning to write have also had that conversation with people. What you want to write, so how would you earn a living? I mean, it's a valid question. But at the end of the day, I think we have to reflect it back and say, well, society has to support us, because actually society needs us. If we don't have people whose work it is to think through solutions for society, then we are not going to have those solutions, as I mentioned before. Now, we can say that we have people who are thinking through strategic plans for businesses, who are devising 20-year plans for our education, who are thinking about the security of the region, with the insurgency in Mozambique and also similarly in other parts of Africa. Yes, we have people who are doing that. But for me, the question is, do we have people who are looking at our societies, our nations, our regions, our continent, maybe even including our diaspora holistically, to say these are some of the big holistic solutions that can be offered? And it could work like this at community level. It could work like this at state level, nation level. I think that's where the lack is. And we also need to have this intellectual practice on the continent, because once one is off the continent, one is in a completely different context. And that doesn't invalidate the intellectual practice there, but it just does mean it's going to have a different angle to the kind of intellectual practice that could be done on the continent. But it is really difficult to get money for those kinds of pursuits. And even our philanthropists on the continent have not yet really understood the importance of it in terms of social cohesion and building it. Of course, we had them of old, especially in the north of the world. but they would have been in Arabic and other languages. And, you know, with our colonial history, that knowledge has not been passed down, you know. And then for me, I'll tell you about how it worked with me. I began to understand these things as I went along. So then at the age of 45, I'm suddenly realizing I have to learn Arabic, you know, and I haven't done that yet. But these are the kinds of demands that are on us now. If we are to aggregate the knowledge that we need in order to go forward. And see if there are any other any other questions here. Okay, did I ever think that nervous conditions will be that well received? No, I didn't. You know, and even now, I don't know how it is for other writers, but I feel I like to get to that point when I'm writing that I'm not thinking about the reception. I'm so into what I'm writing at that moment that I can't think of anything else. It's just a story. This character, you know, they've got to get here, they've got to do that. Oh, you know, oh, how awful. Why does this have to happen? But it's happening. This is where I like to write from. And for me, there isn't any way of thinking about how someone else besides maybe me is going to receive it. So it's kind of like an act of faith. And then, of course, your editor comes along and says, well, did you think about this? Did you think about that? And you say, no, I didn't. And you go back to the drawing board. So that's how it might open out and begin to breathe. But, you know, I think there are probably people who can set out to write a bestseller and do so. Hopefully, I'll develop the knack of that sooner rather than later, but I haven't developed it yet. Okay, what fuels my interest in the convergence of gender and oppression in the continent? It's basically my lived experience. And what I began to see is when I started traveling, which really was with nervous conditions, were the similarities across the continent. Okay, with some differences, but enough similarity, I think, for us to be thinking of continental solutions that can be modified for particular locations. And, you know, I think to myself, my lived experience is all I've really got. There's nothing else that I've got that I will take with me. You know, if I suddenly have to leave where I live, all I'll take with me is my lived experience. So it's very important for me to rely on that and to think of my lived experience as something vibrant, something that has meaning in the world, and to proceed from there. So basically, that's how my creative life works. This isn't to say that it has to be one-to-one. At the moment, I'm working on speculative fiction, but I generally say in conversations like this that you cannot write what you have not experienced because it simply isn't mapped into you. So whatever you're writing has come from somewhere. You know, it might be first-hand experience, or you might have heard something, or you might have seen something happening to somebody else, but you simply cannot write something that has not been encoded in your mind in some way. And so I like to rely on that. Yeah, it could even be from the experience of reading that something opens up in your mind, but it could be by the universe engaging with you, whatever it is, but it has to come into you first before it can come out of you. At least that's the way I look at it. Jerian, I'm glad you like that second person. I'm really glad you appreciated it. It took a while to get there. Spoken about the adaptation. Oh, okay, yes. As a young girl, what books or stories were influential to lead you to write nervous conditions? the one book that I think really echoed in my mind was a book which was then called The African Child. It might have changed title now, by somebody, I think he was from Guinea, called Kamara Laye. And it was a book about a young girl called Fanta. And I read it when I was very young. I must have been about 10 or so. And of course, I called her Fanta. And so it was really funny to read a story about a girl called Fanta somewhere up in the northern parts of Africa. And I could relate to some of the things, but other things, because it was a Muslim community, as far as I remember, I couldn't relate to. But that did say to me that it is possible for you to be in literature. It's not impossible. And then all the rest of the books I read were about white girls, you know, your Enid Blytons, your whatever, won't even go there anymore. And then at some point I started reading Chinua Achebe, and that was literature that I could very much relate to. And then another book that was formative for me at the time was Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and the particular one was A Grain of Wheat, because it told the story of the Mau Mau, and this was just at the time in the 70s when the armed conflict in Zimbabwe was intensifying. And it was shocking, but I could draw some parallels in a very immature way. You know, it wasn't so shocking that I perceived it as being irrelevant. So I think those were some of the foundations for nervous conditions. You know, Ngugi with his talking about colonialism, Achebe talking about African culture and the way people live, and Kamara Laye with this young girl called Fanta. You can see how all of those tropes. Oh, are we going now? Yeah? Okay. Ah, I see. Okay, somebody wants to. We have to. So shall I wrap up? Yes, I should wrap up. So anyway, that answers that. And then, of course, I was reading a lot of English novels about how people loved the areas where they lived, and I loved the area where I lived as well. And I could also see that the culture was changing and was being eroded, and that very soon we wouldn't have a record of it. So all those things that people commented on were important to me, you know, about the way we lived. So at least there was a little record of a little part of the way we lived. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. It was lovely. Thank you so much. I enjoyed myself. Yeah, have a good evening then. Bye. And thank you for your patience. All right.